Hey, I'm Saul. I'm a rank 1 Enhance, and this is my guide for Enhanced PvP in the War Within Season 1. So, in this guide, I'm going to be covering two of the best builds for Enhance, one being Stormbringer Windfury, and one being Totemic Lash. For Stormbringer Windfury, you do insane burst damage, you also have really good consistent damage. The only downside being that if you're getting kited a lot, if you're facing a class that gives you really bad uptime, for example a mage, your damage is going to fall off pretty hard. And the other build we have is Totemic Lash. The upside of Totemic Lash is you do insane consistent damage. Even if you're getting kited, you can keep up on the damage meters. But the biggest downside is that you don't have much burst and it's pretty hard to finish off opponents. The first build we're going to be looking at is Stormbringer Windfury. As for the Shaman General tree, there's not too much to change here. If you're facing an Asteroid Arena, for example, you could drop Encasing Cold and take Poison Cleansing Totem. If you're not facing any Shamans or Warlocks, you could drop Cleanse Spirit and take Short Hex, for example, but there's not really too much to change here, and this is pretty standard. As for the Enhancement tree, this is the build I prefer overall. The only thing you really could be changing is playing On-Use Ascendance over Deeply Rooted Elements. And On-Use Ascendance is decent, but the main problem is that it falls off in a long game. So if your games are lasting less than 1.5 minutes on average, like for example in low-rated solo shuffle, then On-Use Ascendance is totally fine. But once the games start going longer than a minute and a half, I'd recommend using DRE as it brings more value over time. As for hero talents, we take Arc Discharge as it has really good synergy with Ride the Lightning. And for this node here, it doesn't really matter too much, but I find that Nature's Protection gives a bit more value. As for PvP talents, in the first slot, you're going to want to go for Grounding Totem. This spell is insane. It has insane potential in Arena. You can ground Sheeps to stop CC your healer. You can ground Hodges. You can ground Traps from Hunters. You can ground Chaos Bolts from Warlocks. It's pretty much a must pick, and there's almost no time when you would ever want to drop it for anything else. For your second PvP talent slot, you're going to want to be playing Shamanism. It's a really strong offensive cooldown. It pairs insanely well with Doomins, and it gives you insane burst on your goes. This is the worst talent out of all three, though, so if you do need to play something for more survivability, like Burrow, if you want something like Static Field on Battleground Blitz maps, if you want Stormweaver, for example, for extra healing, then this would be the talent you drop, but generally you're not going to want to drop it, and you're going to want to be playing it. And for your third talent slot, you're going to want to be playing Ride the Lightning. The reason why you want to play it, and the reason why it has so much value, well, there's multiple. The first one being that it consumes Arc Discharge charges whenever you Tempest, so that's really, really important. And the second one, which is also something that a lot of people don't know, is that it counts towards your Mastery Stormbringer. So the amount of Maelstrom you actually generate because your Ride the Lightning procs will also automatically reset your Storm Strike whenever you press it and give you more Storm Strike charges is actually insane value, and over the course of a game gives you insane increase in damage and consistent Maelstrom generation. The second build we're going to be looking at is the Totemic Lash build. The general Shaman tree is pretty much the exact same, with the main difference being that you take Lava Burst as it gives you a second charge of Elemental Blast. And for the enhanced tree, there's not really much you can change. This is what you're going to be playing pretty much every single game. For the Totemic Hero tree, I have tried playing a build with Oversurge and Earth Surge to one-shot people, but it doesn't end up doing enough damage, so these are the ones you're going to want to be playing every single game. For the Totemic Lash PvP talents, you're going to want to go for Grounding Totem in the first slot, you're going to want to go for Shamanism in the second slot, and for the third slot you have a lot of flexibility. So let's say you're playing a Battleground Blitz and you have a lot of casters on your team, or even if you're playing threes with a Demo Lock, for example, you're going to want to go for Totem of Wrath a lot of the time. It just gives you extra crit damage and spells, and it's really helpful for other casters around you. The other talent you could go for is Static Field Totem. It's definitely not amazing now after they nerfed the cooldown to 1 minute 30 seconds, but it's not terrible, and it has some niche uses versus some classes that have ports or blinks, for example mages, etc. Burrow is also a really good defensive option and probably the talent I go for most in my third slot. It provides a really good defensive, and you can use it to avoid damage while your healer's sitting CC. You could go for Stormweaver as well. It provides a lot of off healing, and it's really useful in skirmishes or duels, or even in Battleground Blitz if you're going to an off node, you're going to want to play Stormbringer to heal yourself a lot. The best race for Enhanced in PvP is Dark Iron Dwarf. The second best race is Dwarf, and if for whatever reason you want to play Horde, then Orc is the third best race. If you don't want to play any of those three, then play whatever else. It doesn't really matter too much, but those three are definitely the best, with Dark Iron Dwarf being significantly better than everything else. For stat priority, you're going to want to go for 18% haste, and then go for mastery and verse afterwards. Make sure that it's in PvP combat. Your haste doesn't matter outside of PvP combat where your gear scales up. For tier slots, you're going to want to go for head, shoulders, hands, and legs, skipping chest and going for 4 set. There's also an Algari gem, which is a unique gem that you have in the War Within Season 1. There's 2 ones that you're going to want to be using. The damage stack one whenever you're snared, which is very solid in Battlegrounds, as it gives you an extra 1 to 2 to 3% damage. And if you're doing a lot of Arena, then you're going to want to go for the Enduring Bloodstone, which gives you damage reduction while you're stunned, which is very important into Rogues, for example. These are the best comps for Enhance in the War Within Season 1. In 2s, I'd recommend playing with a healer. You can make double DPS work, but it's fallen off a lot after the dampening changes to 2s, so I wouldn't recommend it too much, and it also requires a lot more effort. In 3s, all these comps are totally solid. You can obviously make comps work that aren't listed here, like for example, you could play Fury with Mistweaver, for example, but it's going to be a lot harder, and you're not going to have as much success as with the comps listed here. For add-ons, I mainly just use the general stuff that all PvPers have, like Omnibar and big debuffs, but I do also use a nameplate add-on, which I like a lot. It's the add-on here that you can see, and that add-on is called Better Blizzard Plates, and if you want an import to my settings, then I'll have it linked in the description. The main macros I use are things like Target and Focus for Hex or Shear, or Party 1-2 for Cleanse Spirit or Healing Surge. I also recommend using Shear 1-2-3 if you're getting into 3s. It's a bit daunting at first to get used to, but it's super important to have, especially if you want to improve a lot in 3s. Also, if you want to save some room on your keybinds, you could macro Shamanism and Doomwinds together. While I wouldn't recommend it, I'd say it's probably totally fine in about 90% of cases. There are niche cases where you'd want to stagger them and not use them together, though. So you enter an arena or a battleground as an enhance. What do? Well, the first thing you want to do is apply Windfury weapon and Flametongue weapon. Then you're going to want to apply Lightning Shield. And then you're going to want to make sure everyone in your party has Sky Fury. After that, you're going to want to apply Earth Shield to yourself. And then apply Earth Shield to the teammate that you think is most likely to be attacked throughout the game. Alright, so let's get into the rotation for the Stormbringer Windfury build. The first thing you're going to want to do is to keep your Feral Spirits on cooldown whenever you're able to. So, Feral Spirits, keep them out. Whenever they reset, summon them again. The second thing you're going to want to keep in mind is that Storm Strike is your highest priority spell, and you want to be pressing it as often as you can, unless you have 10 Maelstrom, in which case, you'd want to use a Lightning Bolt. So, Storm Strike, highest priority spell, unless you have 10 Maelstrom. Now, if you don't have 10 Maelstrom and you don't have a Storm Strike, the priority goes as follows. You want to press Ice Strike. If you get 10 Maelstrom, then Lightning Bolt. If you get a Storm Strike back, then press Storm Strike again. If not, and you have none of these spells here, then you go to Lava Lash. By then, you should have either a Storm Strike back or 10 Maelstrom, and you'd be able to press one of those. So that's just your regular standard rotation, and that's what you're going to be doing throughout the game, constantly. Alright, now let's get into the burst. So, for your burst, you're going to want to make sure you summon Feral Spirits. Then you're going to want to do the standard rotation until you have 10 Maelstrom. And once you have 10 Maelstrom ready, you're going to want to use a Lightning Bolt into a Doomwinds, into a Bloodlust, into a Storm Strike, and then do the standard rotation again. So Storm Strike over Ice Strike with Lightning Bolt at 10 Maelstrom. This is how it should look in practice. So we use our Feral Spirits, we build up to 10 Maelstrom, we then use Lightning Bolt, Doomwinds, Bloodlust, Storm Strike, Lightning Bolt, Storm Strike, Lightning Bolt, Storm Strike, Storm Strike, Lightning Bolt, and it goes on. Now we've gone over the rotation and the burst, but there's still a couple nuances to go over. So let's say you're spending your Maelstrom weapon, and it happens to reset from static accumulation. What do? Well, you want to use your Lightning Bolt. If it resets, you use a Storm Strike into a Lightning Bolt. So you want to make sure you're taking advantage of the Legacy of the Frost Witch window, even if it does reset. So that's one of the few times where Storm Strike actually has a greater priority over Lightning Bolt. The other thing is that if you're playing Deeply Rooted Elements and you proc Ascendance, what do? Well, your highest priority spell becomes Wind Strike, and if you don't have a Wind Strike, you want to use a Lightning Bolt. And if you don't have either, you want to use an Ice Strike. Alright, so let's get into the rotation for the Totemic Lash build. Now this one is a lot more complicated than the Stormbringer Windfury build, but once it clicks for you, you will understand how it works, and it will make a lot of sense when you use it. So let's get into all the moving pieces. The first thing you're going to want to make sure you're doing is pressing Surging Totem, keeping it on the enemy as much as possible, using Totemic Projection, and keeping it down the entire game. Second thing is to keep Spirit Wolves on cooldown, like with the previous build. The third thing is to keep Primordial Wave on cooldown. You're going to want to be using it whenever it's up. And the fourth thing is to keep Flame Shock and Lashing Flames on as many people as possible. Fifth thing is to use the Whirling element on Earth on Sundering. So what does that mean? Well, when you press your Surging Totem, you get a bunch of Whirling elements. Thankfully, we don't really have to worry about the air and the fire one too much, but the Earth one either refunds CD on Elemental Blast or Sundering, and it's pretty important to refund the cooldown on Sundering, because that gives you Earth Surge, which is actually a pretty big deal and gives you a bunch of extra damage. Alright, now the next thing is when you're not in your Prime Wave window and you're trying to build Maelstrom, you're going to want to use a simpler Prio-based rotation of Ice Strike into Lash into Storm Strike. You're going to want to mainly be using your Ice Strike and Lash. Storm Strike should only be used maybe once a minute or so. Don't overuse it in this build. And that's how you're going to be building your Maelstrom. Now, when you have 10 Maelstrom, just like with the other build, you're going to want to spend it. Well, how do you spend it? You want to use your Elemental Blast into a Frost Shock. Now, your Frost Shock will be buffed because you used your Ice Strike to build Maelstrom. So, let's say in practice here, we're building our Maelstrom using Ice Strike, using Lava Lash, using Storm Strike. We have some Maelstrom. Now we have 5 Maelstrom. Now we're going to use an Elemental Blast into a Frost Shock. And since the Elemental Blast actually has a decent travel time and the Frost Shock is off or doesn't have a travel time, you're able to actually stack the damage together, especially if you have a lot of haste up from Lust and Prime Wave, so it'll actually do a decent amount of burst damage, and that's very important to keep in mind and to constantly be doing while you're playing this build. Alright, so now that we know the basics about the Totem Lash build, let's get into actually doing the rotation. So, first thing we're going to want to do is to drop a Surging Totem on the enemies. Then, you're going to want to use a Primordial Wave, you're going to want to summon your Feral Spirits, and you're going to want to use Lava Lash to spread Flame Shocks. Once you've done that, you're going to want to use a Lightning Bolt to consume your Primordial Wave, then you're going to use a Sundering to consume your Whirling Earth, then you're going to use Ice Strike, Lava Lash, until you're 10 Maelstrom, then you're going to want to use an Elemental Blast into a buff Frost Shock, then we use Lava Lash. Now we don't have anything else to press, we press Storm Strike, then we're back to Ice Strike. Since we have our Primordial Wave back, we don't want to waste the refund on Maelstrom, so we're going to use an Elemental Blast into a Primordial Wave. We're going to resummon our Surging Totem, we're going to resummon our Feral Spirits, we're going to go back to consuming a Lightning Bolt, then we're going to go back to building with Ice Strike, into Lash, into Storm Strike, into Elemental Blast, into Frost Shock. So it looks very complicated, but once you get the hang of it, it actually makes a lot of sense, and it's pretty simple, and you'll be doing a ton of damage once you get the hang of it. Now, in terms of doing burst damage with the Totem Lash build, it's very similar to just doing the standard rotation. The one thing that you can do, though, is stack your Primordial Wave spending with a Bloodlust, so you use a Lightning Bolt into a Bloodlust, and now you have extra haste. That gets you a lot more globals out faster, and you're able to do a lot more consistent damage for a short window. The other thing you can be doing is using Ice Strike to build Maelstrom like always to get a buff Frost Shock, and if someone's across the map, you can just use an Elemental Blast into a buff Frost Shock and stack them together, since Elemental Blast has a long travel time, and do a decent amount of damage, maybe 15% of someone's health from across the map, and that's a decent way to finish somebody off. But in terms of like crazy burst, this build doesn't have anything too crazy, and it's just about doing insane consistent damage throughout the game. So now let's get into some general tips and tricks. The first one is that Stone Bulwark, the big shield that it gives you, is a purgeable buff. So if you're facing a shaman or a mage, generally you want to drop it and instantly press Grounding Totem right after. This is going to make sure you're not going to get purged right away, and you're going to get insane value on your Absorb Shield. The second tip is to not overuse Hex. I see a lot of shamans, especially at lower rating, constantly go for hexes over and over and over, and you actually end up losing a ton of damage because you're not auto attacking, and a lot of the time you're not going to be getting the hex off. Generally, you only want to use it off of guaranteed CC, so let's say you're facing a team and they're all stunned and you know for sure you can get hex off, then it's great to go for it, but if you don't know that you're going to be able to get it off, don't waste your time casting it over and over. The third tip I have is based around Doom Winds. Now this one might be pretty obvious, but you want to wait for the person you're hitting to use their mobility before you press Doom Winds. For example, if you're facing a mage and you just press Doom Winds on him right as you get to him, what he's going to do is he's going to blink away and you're not going to be able to hit him at all, and you're going to lose your entire Doom Winds and not get anything from it. But what you could do is wait for the mage to use Blink to get away from you, then you get to him, and then you instantly use your Doom Winds and your Lust, and you'll get a lot of cooldowns. The same goes for Warlocks, for example. You want to wait for them to port, and then get to their port, and then use it on them. The fourth tip I have is based around Totemic Projection. This button has insane value, and a lot of people don't utilize it correctly. Now, the first thing that is very common to see is if your healer is very far away from you and he gets feared or seduced, what you can do is you can drop Tremor, which usually you can't move around, it just drops on top of you, and you can move it all the way across the map and get your healer out of a fear. Second thing you can do is you can use it to stop drinks consistently. So for example, let's say there's a healer drinking very far away on a pillar. Well, if I'm standing here, I can only move my totem like this far. But projection actually has a further range than moving or dropping totems. So I can use my projection while standing in the same spot and move the totem even further, getting a healer who might be out of range of me normally. And the last thing that is very useful to projection is that you can use it to control your Surging Totem and keep it on top of the enemies even when they move out of it. This is the biggest reason as to why Surging Totem even works as a PvP talent, and it gets you way more uptime and way more damage with it. And the final tip we're going to cover today is how to properly use Sundering. Now, while you can just use Sundering for pure damage and to proc your Earth Surge from Surging Totem, there are so many other use cases for it, and that's not always the best way to use it. If you're facing any caster, you could use it as an interrupt, so you just knock them down and stop their cast. It's very useful, especially for when you don't have Wind Shear or Grounding Totem. Also, you can use it to layer CC. So let's say you're playing Turbo, for example, and your warrior does a Stormbolt and you're doing big damage into the Stormbolt and the target's dropping low. Well, as the Stormbolt is right about to end, you can use Sundering at the very last second of it, and it'll actually incap them and stop them from using buttons for just a quarter of a second right before it instantly breaks. Even though it does break to any damage, it still will stop them from pressing buttons for a split second, and sometimes that split second is enough to land a kill. Thanks for watching my guide. If you want to keep up to date with the latest enhanced builds, or if you have any other questions, I stream all my arenas at twitch.tv/Saul, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have over there.